You've seen it in 1,000 movies. The stars on the sidewalk, the lights, the glamour, the sense that something historic is always just around the corner. For decades, Hollywood Boulevard was the symbol of American entertainment, the place where the world came to feel a little closer to the magic. But then, you actually show up, and what you find is so far from the dream that it's almost hard to believe. So today, we're getting into exactly that. Why Hollywood Boulevard is dying and tourists are laughing. Part 9. What Hollywood Boulevard actually was. To understand why the fall of Hollywood Boulevard stings so much, you have to understand what it once represented, not just for Americans, but for the entire world. The Boulevard's commercial core began taking real shape in the early 1920s, when developers recognized the area's potential and poured money into it. By that point, the film industry had already planted its roots nearby, and what followed was one of the most concentrated bursts of architectural ambition in American urban history. The vast majority of the Boulevard's defining buildings were constructed between 1915 and 1939, and walking the street during that era meant moving through a corridor of movie palaces, supper clubs, radio studios, and the kind of ornate architecture that signaled, without any subtlety, that something important was happening here. In 1919, Musso and Frank Grill opened its doors, and it's still open today, the oldest restaurant in Hollywood. In 1922, Sid Grauman opened the Egyptian Theater, which hosted the first ever Hollywood movie premiere. 5 years later, he opened what would become the most iconic cinema address in the world, Grauman's Chinese Theater, which premiered Cecil B. DeMille's The King of Kings on May 18, 1927. Grauman built the place for around $2 million, roughly $30 million in today's money, with authentic Chinese-inspired architecture, imported artifacts, and a forecourt that would eventually bear the handprints and footprints of nearly 200 film legends. Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford were the first on April 30, 1927. Humphrey Bogart, Cary Grant, Frank Sinatra, and Marilyn Monroe followed over the years. The Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel opened in 1927 as well, and it hosted the very first Academy Awards ceremony in its Blossom Room in 1929. During the 1930s and 40s, the nearby Knickerbocker Hotel was a regular haunt for celebrity guests, and Radio City at Vine Street brought radio performers flooding into the district. This was a neighborhood that hummed. It was alive with ambition, spectacle, and genuine cultural weight. The Walk of Fame, that 1.3-mile stretch of coral pink terrazzo stars rimmed with brass, was first installed in 1960 and 1961, with an initial 1,558 stars. It was conceived, partly, to encourage the redevelopment of an area that was already beginning to slip. That detail is worth noting, because the story of Hollywood Boulevard's decline didn't start in the 2000s or even the 1990s. The warning signs were there before the walk ever hit the pavement. Part 8. The slow unraveling. Here's the part people tend to forget. Hollywood Boulevard had its first serious decline in the 1960s and 1970s. After the initial installation of Walk of Fame stars in 1960 and 1961, 8 years passed without a new star being added. The neighborhood fell into what historians bluntly call protracted urban decay. Live television tapings dwindled. The studios that had brought so much foot traffic and energy to the area began consolidating and relocating their day-to-day operations. The glamour that had defined the boulevard for 3 decades didn't disappear overnight. It just quietly packed up and moved to other parts of Los Angeles. By the mid-1970s, Hollywood Boulevard had a well-earned reputation as seedy. Prostitution, petty crime, and a general air of neglect had taken hold of a street that, just a generation earlier, had been one of the most celebrated in the country. The 1980s brought some recovery. Johnny Grant, a Chamber of Commerce member who is generally credited with revitalizing the Walk of Fame, had been stimulating publicity since 1968 by requiring each honoree to personally attend their star unveiling. That requirement transformed the walk from a passive attraction into a recurring media event, and gradually the neighborhood began pulling itself back toward relevance. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Hollywood was attracting tourists again, new businesses were opening, and there was genuine optimism about the boulevard's future. It's also worth noting that homelessness in Hollywood is not a new phenomenon either. A tour guide for Red Line Tours, which offers historical walking tours of the Boulevard's old movie palaces, has pointed out that even in the 1920s, actors had such a poor social reputation that landlords refused to rent to them. Signs reading, "No dogs, no actors allowed," were reportedly common in apartment windows. Studios had to build their own housing facilities because so many of their performers were effectively homeless on the street. The specifics have changed enormously over the past century, but the Boulevard's complicated relationship with the most vulnerable people in its orbit has roots that go surprisingly deep. Then the 1994 Northridge earthquake hit, damaging numerous buildings along the boulevard. Rebuilding took years, and while the physical structures were eventually restored, the disruption didn't help an area that was still fragile. Throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s, Hollywood Boulevard straddled an uncomfortable line between revival and relapse. Never quite dirty enough to be abandoned, never quite polished enough to deliver on its promise. Part 7. The fantasy versus the reality. At some point, the gap between what visitors expected and what they actually found became the defining story of Hollywood Boulevard. The image that exists in the global imagination, the one exported through decades of films and television, is of a sun-drenched boulevard populated by movie stars, luxury, and the pulse of American celebrity. That image is, at this point, roughly a century out of date. What tourists actually find today is rather different. TripAdvisor ranks the Walk of Fame 3.4 out of 5 stars on its site and places it at number 64 on its Los Angeles to-do list, behind dozens of other attractions. The reviews are not subtle. One visitor wrote, "The area is run down, dirty, and full of shady figures. Celebrities are hardly met here, but there are plenty of homeless people. We walked down the street once and then moved on quickly." Another noted, "The image you have of the Hollywood Walk of Fame is one of stardom and glitz, but the reality is your average city center with expensive gift shops." That second quote, in particular, has become something of an unofficial tagline for the Boulevard's current state. In late 2025, the luggage storage company Stasher released a study ranking more than 100 major tourist attractions worldwide. The Hollywood Walk of Fame came in dead last, officially branded the worst major tourist attraction on the planet. The analysis factored in Google reviews scores, TikTok engagement, airport accessibility, country safety ratings, and local accommodation quality. The Walk of Fame ranked lowest on Google ratings and safety metrics among all 101 attractions studied. It also lost points for being approximately 23 miles from Los Angeles International Airport. A distance that sounds manageable until you try to actually make that trip in LA traffic, which, up until 2025 when Washington, D.C. briefly took the crown, had been ranked the worst commute in the United States for years. It's not the first time the Walk of Fame has landed near the bottom of Stasher's list. It has been a recurring presence there for years, which makes the achievement of finally claiming the very last spot feel less like a sudden collapse and more like the natural conclusion of a long, slow slide. What's particularly interesting, or painful, depending on your perspective, is that the Walk of Fame's lowest Google score in the study was still a 4 out of 5. The problem wasn't that people gave it terrible reviews. The problem was that 100 other major attractions around the world simply ranked ahead of it across every metric. In a global competition for tourist attention, Hollywood Boulevard is currently losing to almost everyone. Part 6. The costumed characters problem. No discussion of the modern Hollywood Boulevard experience is complete without addressing the costumed characters. The Spider-Men, Batmans, Captain Americas, Mickey Mouses, and assorted others who station themselves along the Walk of Fame and offer to pose for photos with tourists. For years, these performers were a genuine part of the Boulevard's street culture. Some were aspiring actors earning a living while waiting for their break, and many visitors, especially those with young children, found them fun and memorable. But over time, the dynamic shifted. Aggressive tip solicitation became common. Tourists reported being grabbed, followed, and pressured. In some cases, visitors who didn't pay after a photo was taken, sometimes a photo they didn't ask for, found themselves in uncomfortable confrontations. The Los Angeles City Council addressed this directly in 2016, voting to begin drafting rules that would require costumed characters to obtain daily permits to operate along Hollywood Boulevard between Highland Avenue and Orange Drive. The proposal allowed for 20 permits per day. Performers who blocked pedestrian traffic or impeded walkways could lose permit access for 3 months. The move came after years of complaints, and after New York's Times Square had already restricted its own costumed characters to designated painted zones, where anyone caught outside the boundaries could face a fine of up to $500. The permitting system helped, but it didn't fully resolve the tension. Because the core problem isn't really administrative. It's the broader environment that surrounds these performers. When a tourist steps over a homeless encampment to reach a Spider-Man who immediately demands money after an uninvited photo, the whole experience collapses into something that feels less like a trip to a legendary landmark and more like running a gauntlet. Tony Hoover, who owns Redline Tours, a company that offers historical walking tours of Hollywood's movie palaces, described the impact of the street environment on his business. He said that walk-in traffic, visitors who arrived spontaneously, had probably dropped by close to 50% as the neighborhood's reputation worsened. "People want to see the Walk of Stars," he said. "They don't want to be stepping over people who are panhandling, asking for money, sleeping on the sidewalk." Part 5. The homelessness crisis. It's impossible to talk about the state of Hollywood Boulevard without talking about homelessness, and it's impossible to talk about homelessness in Hollywood without acknowledging that the crisis is severe, long-standing, and not easily resolved. Los Angeles County has one of the largest homeless populations in the United States. California as a whole accounts for a disproportionate share of the national total. Despite billions of dollars spent on the problem, former Governor Gavin Newsom's administration directed over $17 billion toward addressing homelessness over 4 years. The street-level reality in Hollywood has remained consistently grim. Along the Walk of Fame, tourists and vendors alike have reported scenes that would not appear in any tourist brochure. People sleeping on the stars embedded in the sidewalk, on benches, in shop doorways. The smell of urine on stretches of the boulevard is mentioned in review after review. Encampments have formed in areas adjacent to the walk, close enough that families with children find themselves navigating through them to reach the attractions they came to see. One TripAdvisor reviewer described arriving early in the morning to photograph the stars before crowds gathered. What they found instead were people sleeping everywhere, on the stars themselves, on benches, in storefronts. "It was very sad," they wrote. "I went early to try to see more stars and take pics, and regretted it." Residents of the Hollywood neighborhood have also spoken out about conditions that go beyond the tourist experience. One local resident, speaking to Fox News, described people walking around unclothed, yelling, screaming in the middle of the night. She said that despite regular complaints to city services, the situation had worsened over time. The challenge for Hollywood Boulevard is that homelessness isn't a problem unique to this neighborhood, nor is it one that a business improvement district or a coat of paint can fix. It's a systemic issue rooted in housing costs, mental health services, addiction, and municipal policy. But for a destination that markets itself on glamour and legacy, the visible human cost of that broader failure lands with particular force. Part 4. The industry left the building. Here's a dimension of Hollywood Boulevard's decline that often gets overlooked. The film and television industry, the reason the boulevard became famous in the first place, has, by almost every measurable metric, left Los Angeles. This didn't happen suddenly. It happened gradually, over decades, driven by economics. The turning point came in 2008 when Georgia passed a law offering a 20% tax credit on film and television productions with an additional 10% if the production included a qualified Georgia promotion. That combined 30% discount, with no cap on total credits and no short-term sunset clause, opened the door to a migration that transformed Atlanta into a major production hub. The film industry spent $93 million on Georgia-based productions in 2007. By 2016, that figure had ballooned to $2 billion. Productions that once would have been shot on lots in Burbank or on the streets of Los Angeles, Marvel superhero films, Netflix prestige series, network dramas, began routing through Atlanta. Trilith Studios, just outside Metro Atlanta, became one of the busiest production facilities in the country. Marvel alone made nearly 24 superhero movies and television shows in the Atlanta area. Then the migration continued beyond even Georgia. The United Kingdom, with its own generous tax credits and lower below-the-line labor costs, began pulling productions away from American soil entirely. By 2025, Marvel was shifting most of its upcoming content to the UK DC Studios, whose recent Superman film shot at Trilith announced its next two films, Supergirl and Clayface, would both film in the UK. Across the industry, 29% fewer movies and television series with budgets above $40 million started filming in 2024 compared to 2022. During the same period, UK production in that budget range grew by 16%. Film LA reported a 5% decrease in Hollywood productions in 2024 compared to the previous year. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass and then Governor Newsom proposed increasing California's annual film tax credit from $330 million to $750 million to try to reverse the trend. But the production infrastructure that once made Hollywood the only logical place to make a film no longer exists in a way that demands physical presence. Streaming has compounded this reality. The rise of Netflix, Amazon, Disney+, and other platforms meant that content could be produced anywhere in the world and delivered directly to a viewer's living room. There's no longer any particular reason a television series needs to be shot in Los Angeles, or for its creators to be based there. And increasingly, they're not. A showrunner in 2025 can write scripts in Austin, shoot in Budapest, post-produce in London, and release globally through a streaming platform, all without setting foot on a soundstage in Burbank or a backlot in Culver City. The pandemic accelerated this decentralization dramatically. When productions shut down entirely in 2020 and 2021, studios and creators discovered that remote work and remote collaboration were more viable than the industry had previously been willing to admit. When things restarted, many of the reasons that had once tied the industry geographically to Los Angeles had quietly dissolved. The 2023 writers and actors strikes reinforced the momentum, with a significant amount of content shifting abroad during the work stoppages, and not all of it coming back. The economic and cultural gravity that once kept the film industry anchored to Hollywood has weakened. What that means for Hollywood Boulevard, a street whose entire identity was built on the proximity of the industry, is that the foundation of its appeal has shifted underneath it. Part 3. The tourism collapse. The cumulative effect of all these pressures, the physical decline, the safety concerns, the homeless crisis, the loss of industry presence, was already visible before 2020. But the pandemic accelerated everything, and the post-pandemic years have brought new challenges that have hit Hollywood Boulevard with unusual force. International tourism to California fell by nearly 9% in February 2025 compared to February 2024, according to Visit California. In the 3 months through August 2025, international arrivals fell by 8%, more than 170,000 fewer global tourists than in the same period the previous year. Overseas visitors to the United States, excluding Canada and Mexico, were down 12% in March 2025 compared to March of the prior year, according to the International Trade Administration. Along Hollywood Boulevard, vendors have reported some of the steepest declines they have ever seen. Michael Logan of Open Bus Tours told reporters that business was down somewhere between 70 and 80%. Young Lee, who owns the Hollywood 21 Market near Hollywood and Highland, said visitor numbers to his shop had dropped 50%. Salim Osman of Ride Like a Star, a company that rents luxury vehicles to tourists for a quintessential Los Angeles experience, said foot traffic fell by nearly 50% over the summer of 2025. "It used to be shoulder to shoulder out here," he said. "It's a lot harder for people to come here, or they're afraid of what's going on here, so they just don't come." Marty Minogue, an employee at One World Tours, delivered one of the starker assessments. "My boss has been out here 26 years. He says it's the slowest he's ever seen. Victor Franco, another vendor, described the spring of 2025 in terms that said everything about the current state of the boulevard. Before, during spring break, you couldn't even walk through here. Like at this time it would be packed. Now it's definitely slowed down a lot. The reasons for the drop are layered. The January 2025 Eaton and Palisades fires generated images of Los Angeles destruction that circulated globally, damaging the city's reputation as a destination. Immigration enforcement actions in the spring created uncertainty among international visitors. Tariff tensions and broader geopolitical strain kept Canadians, historically the largest international market for California, away in significant numbers. Canadian arrivals to California fell nearly 38% by August 2025 compared to the previous year. Governor Newsom launched an advertising campaign specifically to woo Canadians back, but the numbers told their own story. The Hollywood Partnership, which represents the district, reported that visitor numbers had dropped by roughly half over the course of the previous year. The walk-in traffic that once sustained dozens of businesses along the boulevard had dried up in ways that vendors described as unlike anything they had experienced before. Part 2. What the city is trying to do. To be fair, and fairness is worth maintaining here, the situation isn't being entirely ignored. In March 2024, the Los Angeles City Council announced the Access to Hollywood Street Improvement Project, a plan to redesign a 3.6-mile stretch of Hollywood Boulevard. The project includes removing car lanes to install protected bike lanes and dedicated bus lanes, improving crosswalks, and widening sidewalks. The goal is to make the boulevard safer for pedestrians and cyclists, while also making it more inviting for the businesses that line the street. Council also approved $1 million to fund additional public restrooms and a visitor information center to support tourism and economic development. The pedestrian safety rationale is real. Hollywood Boulevard has been the site of a disproportionate number of traffic accidents, and making it safer is a legitimate and valuable goal. But the idea that bike lanes and wider sidewalks will meaningfully reverse the boulevard's structural decline is, to be charitable, optimistic. Some of Hollywood's physical anchors remain genuinely worth visiting. The TCL Chinese Theater, Grauman's original movie palace, was renovated in 2013 into a custom IMAX facility, now seating 932 people with one of the largest screens in North America. It continues to host major premieres. The Dolby Theater, where the Academy Awards take place, draws crowds around Oscar season. The Egyptian Theater, which underwent its own restoration, serves as a functioning cinema and cultural venue. Musso and Frank Grill has been continuously open since 1919. These are real things. They matter. Hollywood Boulevard still has bones worth preserving, but bones are not a destination. And the question of whether the boulevard can rebuild around those bones and become something more than a cautionary tale about urban neglect and institutional failure is one that nobody can answer with confidence right now. Part 1. What tourists are actually saying. Perhaps the most unsparing verdict on Hollywood Boulevard's current state comes not from economists or urban planners, but from the people who saved up for a trip to Los Angeles and made the pilgrimage to the Walk of Fame with a specific picture in mind, and found something else entirely. Their reviews, collected across years on TripAdvisor and Google, form a remarkably consistent account. Visitors arrive with a mental image formed by decades of movies and television. They find a street that is, by most accounts, physically intact. The stars are still there. The Chinese Theater is still there. The Dolby is still there. But that exists within an environment that makes it very difficult to enjoy any of it. Don't expect to see the glamour of Hollywood, as it's disappointing, one reviewer wrote. The image you have of the Hollywood Walk of Fame is one of stardom and glitz, but the reality is your average city center with expensive gift shops. The phrase average city center is the one that sticks, because Hollywood Boulevard is not just supposed to be a city center. It was supposed to be the city center of the entertainment world. A place with actual cultural gravity, a place that earned its reputation and continued to live up to it. Instead, it has become a place that trades almost entirely on nostalgia for a version of itself that no longer exists and charges a premium for the privilege of that disappointment. For visitors over the age of 35, many of whom grew up watching Hollywood Boulevard in films and imagining what it might be like to walk those sidewalks, the gap between expectation and reality hits with particular sharpness. These are people who remember when Hollywood was shorthand for the best of American culture, not a cautionary story about a neighborhood that couldn't hold itself together. And the laughter from tourists that the title of this video references isn't really laughter of amusement. It's the nervous, disbelieving kind. The kind you let out when you've spent money and time and anticipation to get somewhere, and what you found is so far from what you expected that there's no other rational response. Can it come back? The honest answer is maybe, but not easily, and not without confronting the real problems rather than the cosmetic ones. Hollywood Boulevard still has genuine history embedded in every block. The architecture, the theaters, the walk itself. These are not nothing. They represent a cultural legacy that most streets in the world would envy. The TCL Chinese Theater alone holds more film history in its forecourt than most museums hold in their entire collections. But history alone doesn't sustain a destination. What makes a place worth visiting is a combination of experience, safety, accessibility, and the feeling that the place itself respects the visitor enough to be worth their time. Hollywood Boulevard, right now, is struggling on most of those counts simultaneously. The film industry's move away from Los Angeles isn't reversing quickly. The homeless crisis doesn't have an obvious near-term solution. International tourism is down, and while some of the forces driving that decline, geopolitical tension, immigration policy, global perception of the United States, are beyond the Boulevard's control, they are very real. What might be within the Boulevard's control is a genuine, sustained commitment to what the neighborhood's better advocates have always argued for, treating the area not as a tourist trap to be monetized, but as a cultural heritage site to be genuinely maintained and respected. That means real investment in safety and cleanliness. It means addressing the conditions that make the experience actively unpleasant rather than simply average. It means being honest about the gap between the brand and the reality, and actually doing something about it rather than announcing plans and then letting them stall. There's also a broader reckoning that the film industry itself needs to have with the physical place that carries its name. When productions leave Los Angeles for Georgia, the UK, Canada, or Australia, they take something more than jobs and spending. They take the ongoing, living connection between Hollywood as a place and Hollywood as an idea. That connection is already frayed. The longer it goes unaddressed, the harder it becomes to repair. Because at some point, the word Hollywood is just a brand name for a global industry, and the boulevard that shares that name becomes a faded souvenir of something that happened elsewhere. Whether Los Angeles has the political will and the resources to do that is a separate question. What's clear is that the current trajectory isn't sustainable. A landmark that consistently ranks as the world's worst major tourist attraction is not coasting on fumes. It's running on empty. Hollywood Boulevard deserves better. And so do the millions of people who still make the trip to stand on those stars, looking down at the names of people who built something remarkable and trying to feel some connection to it. The magic was real once. Whether it can be again is entirely up to the city that allowed it to disappear. If you found this video worthwhile, please hit the like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel grow. There's more where this came from.